Thanks, Sue. And hi, everyone. What I'm going to go through in today's webinar are some of the best practices for using the Deltek expense product, as well as give you some ideas for how to use the expense system that you may not have already thought of. I'm also going to show you how to research and resolve some issues, some common problems that people experience as they fill out their expense report. So what I'm going to go through today specifically are the options for attaching receipts. You have several different options available. One is you can attach it to the overall expense report or to individual expenses, as well as you can attach it to an expense report and or an expense authorization. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the term expense authorization, what that represents in the expense system is a travel approval form or a pre-travel form. Sometimes it's called a TAR, T-A-R, travel authorization request. The expense system calls them expense authorizations. And you can attach receipt attachments or files to an expense authorization as well as an expense report. The next thing I'm going to go over are the options you have for per diem, specifically per diem meals and per diem lodging. So for meals, you have several different ways of filling out an expense report or to set up the system to allow the user to get reimbursed for meals any way you need it to be. You can reimburse the actual per diem amount that the government specifies, or you can reimburse what the employee actually spent. And within that, you have the ability of reimbursing over that amount as well. For per diem lodging, I'm going to show you how to set that up with the same sort of options that you have, as well as show you how you can apply any oversealing amount to an unallowable account. So what I'm going to do first is walk through how to set up each of these things, and then I'll walk through and show you what they look like in the expense system. The third thing I'm going to go over are common errors or common problems that people have when they fill out their expense report, and how to correct those, how to research those, and how to get them fixed. A lot of these are typical when you first start using the expense system or when you add expenses, different types of expenses, to the expense report system. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go into the expense system. Give me 1 second. Let me open up my screen. And we're going to go over the options you have for receipts or other attachments. It's a 3 or 4 step process with the decisions that you have to make in each one of them. So the first thing you have to identify and decide on is whether or not you want employees to attach a receipt or attach a file to the overall expense report or to the individual expenses that are within an expense report. That's actually set up in the general configuration screen. It has nothing to do with expense. It's actually done in the general config screen. In this screen, in the lower right-hand corner, there's an attachment link. When I click on that, it brings me to this dialog box at the bottom. And you'll see I have 3 different types of attachments set up. This third one down here at the bottom actually comes with the system, and it comes exactly the way this has been configured. It's for expense receipts, and it's done for the individual expenses. So this comes with the system, and if you want to do it another way, let's say, for example, you want to attach a receipt to the overall expense report, you need to add an attachment type, which is what I've done here for the second one. I've added an attachment type for the overall expense receipts. And you'll notice I still linked it to my expense report, but my level is overall. The third one that I have up here at the top is for my expense authorizations. I can add an attachment to an expense authorization if I so want. So that's your first decision you have to make. You can either do one or you can do all of them. But the second decision you have to make is if you've picked that you're going to have employees attach a receipt to each individual expense, you have to go through your setup and determine which types of expenses are going to require a receipt. And that is done here in the expense type screen. I'm going to go to Manage Expense Types. I'm going to do a query. And I'll pull in all of my expense types that I've created. Now you should create these first, of course, before you go in and make this decision. And again, this is customizable for each company. So what you have in your system might not match what I'm showing here. But these are fairly generic, the ones that I've set up. So hopefully the ones you have are very similar to this. So you will have to go through each individual type of expense and select which ones you're going to attach a receipt attachment task to. So I've picked my airfare expense. Down here at the bottom, I'm going to hit the tasks link, and I've added a task for the employee to attach a receipt to this type of expense. I also have a threshold set up for $0. What that means is any expenses over 0 will require an attachment. Some folks like to set up a threshold of, say, $20, so any expenses over $20 require a receipt. Others like to make a receipt required for all expenses. In that case, you set your threshold equal to 0. And like I said before, you do have to go into each expense, for example, baggage fees and business meals. Some of the expenses that don't typically require a receipt are mileage. And another one is the per diem meals. You'll notice I have one here for per diem meals, and there's no task set up. And we'll talk about per diem here in just a second. So once I've determined the types of expenses I have to set up, now I have to set up my tasks for the overall expense report. So it knows that a receipt may be required. That's done here in the Manage Expense Report Type screen. I'm going to do my query and pull in my expense report types. And again, this is customizable for each company. So yours might look a little different than mine, but I have a travel and I have a non-travel. So I'll highlight the row. I'm going to go down here at the bottom to expense report tasks. And it's going to show all of the tasks that I have for this type of expense report. Now you could have one type of expense report. Let's say your travel expenses require one set of receipts and your non-travel require another. So you could have different settings for each different type of expense report. But you'll see I've set up 2 attachment tasks. One is for my receipts, and that's at the individual level, and it's based on the attachment type that I've configured. And I have another one set for the overall expense report. So if you decide to require receipts at the overall expense report level, all you need to do is set up the type of attachment and then set it up here as a task. If you decide you want receipts done at the individual expense level, you have an additional step where you have to set up the setting, the type of attachment. You have to go into the expense type and determine which types of expenses require a receipt, and then come in here and add a task for the overall expense report so it knows to go out and pull those expense types and determine that there's a task is required. The fourth item that has to be set up isn't typically done by the expense admin crew, but I want to walk you through what has to be done. And that's identifying the types of extensions, the types of files that are required, or allowed, I should say. And that's set up here under the System Administration section, under the Configure System Settings screen. At the very bottom of the screen are the different file extensions that are valid for this system. Now this will apply to both the Costpoint system and the T&E system. So it's a system-wide setting. And you'll notice I have one set up for JPEG files and I have one set up for PDF files. Both of those are typically used on expense reports. You can add additional file types. For example, some folks like to add Excel spreadsheets, so you can add an Excel extension. Some people like to do GIF files, things that come from a digital camera or a phone. You can add a GIF or a GIF file here as well. You can add whatever you need to. The maximum size column that I have here, I have it all set to 10 megabytes. That is probably far larger than you'll ever need for expense attachments. But if you happen to have a large file, or if you set this to a smaller number and the file size is large, if it exceeds that limit, the system won't let you attach that file. So I bumped it up here a little bit for our demo, but you can set it up to whatever your system requirements allow you to do. So that's the setup of how to attach a receipt and where to set it up in the system. Now what I want to do is walk through and show you what it looks like on an expense report. So I'm going to go into the expense report system and start one. I'll go to expense reports and then manage expense reports. And I should note also that I'm using time and expense version 10, which is the latest version of the system. You might be on an earlier version, which might look a little different, but this one is the latest and greatest, so I'm going to use this for the demo. Okay, I'll give my reasons here. I pick my domestic travel expense report type. I'm going to add my location, just like I always do for my expense reports. I'll pick a city. Go ahead and apply that. Of course, you also have to add in your project. So let me go ahead and type in a project. I'll hit continue. Now this next screen here, this will be shown if you're requiring your employees to attach one file for all of their expense receipts. It does it at the beginning of the expense report, and you have to go in and select your file. So if all of your expense receipts are missing, there's an option to check the missing checkbox, and then you have to give a reason. But since I have my receipt file, I'm going to go ahead and pick it and select it. Go ahead and upload it. So this will be shown if you selected that this type of expense report requires receipts at the overall expense report level. And I'll save my expense report. Now what I'm going to do is show you where to attach a file at an individual expense level. I'll go in and I'll pick my airfare receipt or expense. I'll fill it out like I normally do. So let me just hop in here and I'll fill out some expenses here, my expense amount. My charge allocation screen, I'll check that and make sure it's right. And when I hit continue, it brings me to the same expense attachment screen. So it looks very similar, but what it's doing is now on each individual type of expense that requires a receipt, it's going to bring up this screen. So something, for example, like mileage that doesn't require one, it doesn't even show the screen. You can just bypass it. Let me pick my airfare receipt. I'll upload it. So you have two different options. The same rules apply with an expense authorization. It brings it in if it's for overall authorization, it'll show at the beginning. And if it's for individual types of expenses, it'll show it at the end before you hit the save button. If you have any questions about how the receipts are set up or how different attachment types are set up, please write it down in the question and answer section, and we'll get back to you just as soon as we can. The next area that I'm going to go over are per diem expenses. We have per diem meals and per diem lodging types of expenses. And I'm going to go through how to set those up and the options that you have. I'm going to go out of here and go into my expense controls and under manage expense types. Here I'm going to query my per diem types of expenses. And yours might be called something a little bit different. But I've set up 3 different types of expenses. 1 for lodging and 2 for meals. I'm going to go over the government per diem meals first. When I click on this, the way that this system is set up, to reimburse the employee what the government per diem rate is, you have to check the per diem checkbox that tells the system to look at the per diem rates. And then just to the right of that is a type dropdown. Your options are allowance or ceiling. To reimburse the employee what the per diem rate specifies, you'll pick allowance. And so for these types of expenses, that's about all you need to set up. You'll notice at the bottom, like I mentioned before, a receipt is not typically required for meal expenses where you're reimbursing them what the per diem amount is. But you should note that when you pick allowance and when you reimburse what the per diem amount is, let's say, for example, if the breakfast amount is $8 and they spend $12, they'll get reimbursed $8. If they spend $6 on breakfast, they'll still get reimbursed $8. So it reimburses exactly what the per diem amount is. It's not an up to per diem amount. That one is done on this next type we're going to go over. Click to the next button here. I set it up as meals actuals. What that means is the employee is going to get reimbursed what they've actually spent. And here you have a little more options, a little more decisions you have to make. So again, I'm going to check the per diem checkbox so the system will use those rates as a guide. And my type this time is going to be ceiling. What this will do is it makes the employee enter in for each meal how much is spent and the system will analyze that against the per diem amount for that date, the location, and the meal itself. The next thing you have to decide is whether or not you're going to reimburse your employee if they go over the per diem amount. If they go under, they get the under amount. They get that $6 if the per diem is $8. But if they spend $10 and per diem is $8, you have to decide whether or not you're going to reimburse that. That's done on the right-hand side here under the oversealing rule. You can either reimburse it or not reimburse it. You also typically have to add receipts for these types of expenses. So I've added an attachment task for the receipt. The last decision that you have for this type of expense is whether or not the ceiling amount should apply each day, or does it apply over all of the days combined? This is useful if you want the employees to limit how much they spend each day versus whether or not if they eat less expensive meal on the first day, they can eat a more expensive meal on the second day. That's done here in the ceiling calculation section or field. If you mark it down as looking at each day, it's going to keep each day individual. So if the total amount for per diem is $38 and they only spend $36, they'll get reimbursed just the $36. If you pick the total of all days, the system is going to add together all of the days for that trip. And if they spend more one day and less for another, it'll use the aggregate and it'll look at all the days combined to determine whether or not they're going to be reimbursed for that expense. And if you decide to reimburse them, it will decide whether or not or how much of the oversealing goes to the specific GL account that you set up. And that brings me into the next type of expense, which is our lodging. And this is set up very similarly to how we set up our per diem meals. You do have the option of either reimbursing the government per diem rate for lodging, or you can reimburse what they actually spend. I found that typically most companies reimburse what the employee actually spends, and anything over the per diem amount goes to an unallowable GL account. So first we'll walk through the setup of it. It's very similar to how we set up the meal expense, where we pick the per diem checkbox, again, to use it as a guide or a ceiling, and we pick ceiling as the type. Once more, if I pick allowance, it's going to reimburse them what the per diem amount is, regardless of how much they actually spent. By us picking ceiling, it's going to look at it as a guide and reimburse up to the per diem amount. If you want to reimburse all of the expense, come over to the right-hand side, and the oversealing rule should be set to reimburse. Now, a lot of people like to put that oversealing rule to unallowable, which I just mentioned. So that is set up in what's called the charge type screen. Let me close out the tasks. It's set up down here, or it's linked down here at the bottom. You'll notice I have 3 charge types for lodging expenses, one for direct, one for G&A, and one for overhead. You might have additional ones depending on how your pools are broken out or how you have to reallocate your expenses, but I have 3 in this example. So I'm going to go into my expense charge type screen, and we'll take a look at those. I have three records. Again, here's my direct lodging, G&A, and overhead. Down at the bottom is where the system identifies the GL account for each type of expense. So in this case, I got my direct lodging lined up or selected, and I have a row here for under ceiling. What this means is the system is going to apply anything under the per diem amount to this GL account. In this case, it's a direct GL account. So anything under the per diem is going to go there. Here's where it gets a little tricky, is for the over per diem. Anything over per diem, if it is reimbursed to the employee, goes to the over ceiling row. If you want to put the amount over ceiling to unallowable, you simply put the unallowable account here. When the system does this calculation and it looks at how much was spent, it will put the under ceiling to this 550-10-004. Anything over that per diem ceiling goes to this unallowable account. There's an option here, if I click the new button, I'll show you, to pick an unallowable row. This is used exclusively for the amount that's entered into the unallowable bucket on the expense report. And you can configure each expense to either show that unallowable bucket or not show it. But I'm going to ignore this here. I'm going to delete this row out, and I'll show you how it works. using the over ceiling line, because that's what the system looks at when you put in an amount over the ceiling amount. Go ahead and save that. Now what I'm going to do is go through the different types of expenses that we just talked about. Let me go back into my expense report. I'm going to add a claimed expense, and I'll do the meals first. First, I'm going to pick that using the government rate. This is the one we set up to reimburse the per diem amount based on the government calculations or government files. There's my location, and it's based here on the per diem rates. So it'll show you how much is allowed for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And again, the system doesn't care at this point how much the user actually spent. That's just as a guide. And it brings you to this meal detail screen. This is a little different from like an airline ticket because it isn't required for that type of expense. But here is where the employee will come in and they'll identify the meals that they're claiming. So in this case, they're claiming breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the 30th, for the one day. And the reason I'm unchecking this is I'm going to show you both different types of expenses. And the system has a validation in place where you cannot claim the same meal for the same day twice. So if I were to go in and enter in my other expense for the same expense report, I'm going to get an error saying I've already claimed it. The system will look at both this expense report as well as any other expense reports that you've entered. And on top of that, it will look at anybody else's expense reports where you're claimed or that employee is claimed as an attendee for a meal. So it pretty much covers the fact that you can only claim one meal one time. I'm going to go through here. Now you'll notice this one, my expense incurred amount is grayed out because the system will calculate how much I get. And it did take into account the 75% rule for my first and last day of travel. If you have that rule and need it set up, we don't have time today to go through that, but please put that in the Q&A and I'll provide the setup steps for that as well. And notice my charge allocation screen here gives my GL account. Everything is under ceiling because it's just the amount that's the per diem, so it's all considered under ceiling, and I'll save it. Now I'm going to add a claimed meal for the per diem where they get reimbursed the actual amount. I look up, continue. Same rule here. I can look at the per diem amount, but this one looks a little different when I come to my meal detail screen. Here I have to check the checkbox and then enter in how much I spent. Enter in some amounts. My incidental. So you'll notice here's my error message because I've already claimed this meal. It looks like I picked the wrong day. So let me go through and I'll undelete them here. My apologies, I picked the wrong date here. And then I'll go ahead and hit continue. So again, because I've entered in the individual amounts, I can't modify this here. It's a display only field. And I'm going to hit the continue. And here, I'm at my charge allocation under ceiling. You'll notice on the breadcrumbs, it's added a field here for over ceiling because the amount that I actually spent is over the per diem amount. So the system knows it's smart enough to know and look at it and calculate it. And it's going to tell me that 38.25 is under ceiling, but 8.25 is over ceiling. And you'll notice the over ceiling goes to the unallowable account. Now this one, I'm also required because it's a per diem where I'm actually getting paid the amount I spent, I have to add an attachment. Whereas the per diem meal, I did not. And again, that's based on how the expense type was set up. I'm going to go ahead and save it. And I'll go through the lodging expense as well. Lodging. Again, I have my location. I can look at the per diem rates. And now I need to enter the room rate and the tax rate. Now I'm purposely going to go over the per diem amount so we can take a look at it. But it's very important to enter in how much was spent on room versus how much was spent on taxes, because the system will analyze that amount and it could adjust the per diem amount based on those values. The system does not want to penalize the employee if they went to a location that had very high taxes. If they had a state tax and a local tax and a city tax and a resort tax, it doesn't want to penalize the employee for staying at that location. So it will modify the per diem rates based on that. There's a algorithm in place where it looks at how much was spent and how much is considered oversealing and undersealing, and it will adjust the per diem amount. That's why it's very important to be as accurate as you can on the room rate and the tax rate. I think, let's see if I went over the ceiling. On the amount here. 175. So in this case, I'm under the ceiling amount. You'll notice I don't have an oversealing. Didn't happen to look and see what the per diem amount was, but if it was oversealing, it would have gone to the unallowable account, similar to how the meal expense did when we were oversealing on the meals. And in this case, also, I need a receipt, so I'm going to go ahead and attach my receipt. Upload it here. And again, if you do have any questions as far as how to set up your meal expenses, please put it in the Q&A section there, and we will get back to you just as soon as we can with those answers. The next area that I wanted to go over is issue resolution or troubleshooting. Typically, this happens when you're first setting up the expense system and you're first testing it out, but it could happen at any point in time if, say, you're adding some additional types of expenses and an employee goes in and tries to use it for the first time. The first one I'm going to go through is when they're trying to enter a project and they can't find it to put on their expense report. So in this case, I'm going to set up a new expense report to go through that. So what I'm going to do is enter in a new expense report. Give it some dates on my expense. And again, I have to add a location, so let me go in here and grab a location in California. Here. I'll continue. Now here's where you normally do a lookup and pick your project. Let me do a lookup, and I want to do one, let's see if it's here, for top shelf. And it is here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this expense. I'm going to add my attachment and my receipt. And I'll save my expense report. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back in and I'm going to add a new default charge. So over here on the left-hand side is my breadcrumbs. I can always go back into any of these tabs and I can click on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to add a new one. Let's see if I have one that's here. And I wanted to add 10023.200. And you notice it doesn't exist. So let me go ahead and figure out what's wrong with that. So the first thing I need to know is what is the project I'm trying to enter. So I'm going to try to look up 10023.200.02. I'm going to go to my configuration screen under Master Data and go to Manage Projects. Query. Let's see if it even exists. Maybe I have the wrong project number. So it is there. So what is wrong? Why can't I pick this on my expense report? So the first thing I see over here on the left-hand side, the type that I have is for set for time for this project. It's clearly an expense project because it has expenses in it. What you'll need to do is change this to be either expense or both. So your company may have labor-only projects or tasks, which would be set straight up to time. And you may have other tasks or other projects that are just for expenses, where you'd pick expenses. And some projects, you might be able to charge both time and expense to it. You'd pick both. What this will do is it limits what's available in the lookup based on how this setting is set. If it's time, it'll only appear on the lookups on your timesheet. If it's expenses, it'll only appear on the lookup for expenses. So let me go ahead and save this. Now I've already started my expense report, so chances are I may have to restart it because of this error, but let's see if there's anything else that might be causing this first before we go in and try it. So oftentimes, companies set up what is called a workforce. So let's make sure that I am included on the workforce. So that is set up here under the maintain charge trees. So let me go to my project. Let me find my top shelf. Here's my charge number. So it's in the workforce, so that's good. And you'll notice the restrict access is checked. That means it is restricting who can charge to it. To look at this in more detail, you'll come to the lower right-hand side and click on this charge restrictions link. You'll notice it's empty. There's nobody here. I'm going to add my name, and my ID will pop up, and I'll save the record. Now, I should note that you will want to take caution if you make any changes to the time and expense system without also updating Costpoint, because the fact that I was not set up in the workforce means that when I export this expense report, chances are I'm going to get an error once I import it into Costpoint, because I probably was not set up in the workforce in Costpoint. So it's one of two things. Either the employee picked the wrong project or the Costpoint setup is incorrect. If they are positive that's correct, maybe it's a timing thing and they just haven't gotten around to adding it to the Costpoint system, you can add it here to this charge tree, and that will allow the employee to continue filling out their expense report. But please remember, you do need to make sure Costpoint is correct as well. Let me just save or close out of this. Now I believe I have to start it over again. Let me double check. Oh no, it is here. Good. Maybe not. All right, so I do need to go back and re-add in my expense reports. Let me back it up. Let's see if I can just get by with continuing. And let's see if it'll show up. I've also often told my employees this, to try to go back, try to refresh, try to boot out. Looks like we are going to have to start it again, so I'm going to go ahead and close it out and say okay. And I think we will have this issue resolved. Let me quickly go back in and set this up. Add in my dates. Pick my location again. And I know you may have some complaints about having to redo this. Unfortunately, the system has to reset itself. Let's see if this will work. Still not working. And if this still isn't working, the best thing to do is to log out of the system completely, whereas I just logged out of the screen. Have your employee log out of the system completely and log back in. Let's give that one more shot and let's see if that works. You may have to start it again. Let's see if that fixes the problem. It brings me back to that same expense report, so that's good. Let me go into the default charges screen here again. Let's add a new one. And there it is. So sometimes the system needs to completely refresh to add the other project back in. So these are other tricks you can try get the system to work the way you need it to. I'm going to go ahead and I have my receipt attachment there, so we should be good. Now, the next type of issue that comes in is the more common issue that I've seen happen throughout systems. And that's when the charge type is missing, or the employee tries to enter in and they use the lookup and it's not there, or a charge type is there, but the account is missing. I'm going to go in here, I'm going to add an expense that might be missing that information. I'm going to go in here, let me add a tolls expense. And I'll go through, and I'll add in my amount. Now you'll notice my charge type is here, but the account is missing. If I try to continue, it's going to tell me that the account was required. That needs to be resolved. So to do this, you as the administrator are going to need to know a couple of pieces of information. One is the project ID. Let's look that up first, write it down. It's 10-10023. It's these two right here. Let me write that down. And you're also going to need to know the type of expense that it is. And that's shown up here. So if the employee can't remember, you can have them walk you through what it is, and then you can write down this information because this is where it's shown. Let me go ahead and close this error message. And what you're going to need to do is do a couple of things first to research it. Go into the Manage Expense Type screen, and let's query this expense. Here's the tolls expense. What you're going to look at is down here at the bottom, these charge types. You'll notice I have 3 charge types that are set up. This is the first thing you're going to want to check. If there are no charge types, that means the system doesn't have anything to pull from. So you want to make sure that there is at least one that is set up for this type of expense. But I have 3, and they look like they're fine from this point of view. So we're going to move forward to the next step. So another thing is I know the project ID, and I know that it's a direct project. So I can concentrate on this charge type. The other 2 are for G&A and for overhead, so I don't need to worry about those. I'm going to go here, I'm going to go under expense charge types, and I'm going to look up that particular charge type. Here. Let me just verify that was the right type. So you'll notice here, I don't have an account listed in my charge type details. So that could cause the problem. Let's go in there, let's find it. I think it was in other travel, it was for tolls. I'm going to pick that. And I'm just going to save it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my expense report, and I'm going to see if that fixed it. I'm going to go back to my expense report, and you'll notice it's still blank there. Let me see if I can fix it just by doing a lookup. And the account pops in. Now I should be able to save it. Let's give it a try and see if that saves the expense report. Let me add my receipt. I'll save it. So these are a couple of the issues that people usually get when they first start using the expense system. But again, it could happen at any point in time. Now, if that still looked right, if that charge type did have an account set up, the next place I would go and look is here under the project. Let me pull up that project ID. So that 550 account number should also appear down here in the account links for that particular project. So in this case, it does, because that did solve the problem. But it would appear here. If it wasn't here, that's another issue added to this project. Now again, the same rules apply. If you add it here to this project, you'll need to add it on the project, on the Costpoint side for that project. Otherwise, when you go to import it in, you're going to get an error message. So we always want to make sure the two systems are in sync. If we make a change to one system, we want to make sure the other system is as well. So let's say that this account also is here and it looks right. The next thing you want to do, slide that down, is you want to make sure that the account is linked to your orgs. I'm going to go into my org screen, or I'm sorry, into my account screen. We'll start with the ones that start with 550. We'll look at all of them. These are all my travel accounts. I'm going to pick my travel other. I'm going to look at my org links. Let's make sure it's linked to my org, and it is. So again, this is the next place I would go. If there still isn't, everything appears to still be working right, what you may end up having to do is go in and resetting up the charge type. There may be a glitch in the system if one of these steps did not work. I rarely find that. Usually going through each of these different steps will resolve the issue. But if that does happen, try resetting up that charge type and relinking it in, and hopefully that will correct the issue. So that's all that I had for today. So if you do have any questions or if you want any additional help, please put it in the Q&A section that we have listed, and we'll try to get back to you just as soon as we can. So I'm going to turn it back to Sue to do the wrap up. Thanks, everybody.